This B Podcast Network show is presented by IXL. IXL's all-inclusive online teaching and learning platform simplifies edtech needs and accelerates achievement in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. IXL delivers personalized learning across a comprehensive pre-K-12 curriculum, including math, language arts, science, and social studies, and it helps you assess student performance through actionable real-time insights at every level of your school or district. This one solution performs work that typically requires dozens of different tools. Want to find out why so many leading districts trust IXL? Visit ixl.com/BE. That's ixl.com/BE. We're proud to be sponsored by MyFlex Learning. MyFlex Learning is a scheduling platform that helps middle and high schools meet the individual needs of all students. Schools can easily create and manage time for flex blocks, win time, activity periods, RTI, counselor and teacher appointments, and much more. And with its built-in accountability tool and reporting features, MyFlex Learning solves your challenges around getting kids where they need to be and understanding how flex time is spent. Make your flex time work for you. Visit myflexlearning.com/BE to learn more and receive $500 off the first year. That's myflexlearning.com/BE. Welcome in, everybody, for the latest episode of the Authority Podcast on the B Podcast Network. We're so pleased to have you here. I'm Ross Romano, and my guest today is Dr. Mike Gaskell. He is the principal at Hammarskjold Middle School in East Brunswick, New Jersey, and he's also been a special educator and assistant principal in Paramus. He also is the host of the Big Ideas and Small Windows podcast on this very network, so we'll pop the link there below so you can check that out as well. Mike is here today to talk about his latest book, Radical Principles, which is published by Routledge Eye on Education. And Mike, welcome to the show.
Ross, it's great to be here with you. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Yeah, so I think before we get right into the book, listeners, Mike's joining us here actually from the airport on his way home from the FETC conference. And, by the time you're listening to this, it'll be a couple months post-conference. But while it's fresh in your mind, what's something you heard about at the conference or learned about that you want our listeners to hear about?
Yeah, sure. So a lot about ChatGPT, of course. That seems to be the burning question. And what's really cool about things like this is we have a choice. I think we have to embrace it and make the best of it, or we can fight City Hall, and that's not going to work. So it's here, it's coming. And there's also some ways to teach kids responsibly how to use it. Is every kid going to use it responsibly? No, cheating's been around since testing has occurred. But
Right.
The kids who are really learning will benefit from this. And I think that there's some exciting opportunities to leverage it. That was one thing. The other thing is there's some great people who just share super ideas that I'm taking notes like crazy on my phone and just really diving right in with the ability to get some great immersive ideas, which is what I did. A lot of stuff that's mainly the idea that it's automated stuff when you have AI. Let me start that over, okay? So a lot of the second things that I want to mention are artificial intelligence concepts right on our laptop, right on our phones, and the ability to use that for video, audio, interpretation kinds of things. Lots of neat stuff that's coming or is on its way and becoming a big part of.
Yeah, there's some pretty remarkable stuff happening in technology that really has accelerated a lot over this past year, and saw some good ideas for how teachers can use technologies like ChatGPT to make their lives a little bit easier and just try to be creative in a new way. And it makes so much sense to use it with intentionality, to not try to hide from it, to understand that, kids will figure out ways to use these things, and it has a lot of benefit if we learn how to use it right. And those are some good ideas coming out of there. So moving into your book here, I like the fact that in the recent months here on the Authority, we've had an opportunity to almost start to form our own dictionary of terms around education and leadership. We had Tanya Sheckley on talking about rebel educators and what that is. We talked about what it means to get weird with CJ Casciata. We defined the term like socks on a rooster with Mike Ficara. And we even talked about de-implementation with Peter DeWitt and how that term, which didn't originate in education, can be utilized in schools. So I want to pose it to you, Mike. Your book is called Radical Principles. So what is a radical principle?
All right, so I'm going to just share something with you that's right in the book, and it just sums it all up. And it talks about radical approaches, but keep in mind that these are education leaders and educators applying these principles. So radical approaches are the sorts that are crazy the day before they're brilliant. The payoff is enormous, especially for children who are disadvantaged. Students are the real winners of fearlessly radical principles, who vigorously and willfully demand equitable opportunities within their school community for all. So that really kind of sums it up. And the bottom line is you need to think about being radical as not being insane, not having a career-ending revolution. Instead, what we should be doing is finding ways to work cleverly around some of the challenges that persist in schools. And one of the biggest parts of that has to do with the unintended consequences of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, we have great roles in schools. We do a great job, setting bells up, telling kids they have to do this, have to be there, and have to follow certain guidelines. We do a great job of that. The problem is some of those systems actually create barriers for the kids who need to be so bridged, so assisted or supported in ways because they're already at a disadvantage. And what ends up happening is we end up actually making it worse for them. So I talk a lot about that, and then I unpack it, and then I talk about, more importantly, solutions to work around that.
In my work, I've collaborated directly with hundreds of educators to support their success. Do you know which of their EdTech frustrations comes up time and again? The sheer number of tools out there and the difficulty of knowing which ones schools like theirs are using to get results. iExcel is different. Not only does it perform the functions of dozens of tools, it's currently delivering results for 1 in 4 U.S. students, including those in 95 of the top 100 districts. Another major pain point that comes up when a school is excited to implement a new tool only to find out the teachers hate it. Yikes. It helps to know that iExcel is loved and trusted by more than 1 million teachers, saving them time on prep work while enabling them to better support student learning. iExcel is research proven to accelerate achievement. Studies across 45 states show that iExcel schools outperform non-iExcel schools on state assessments. And independent research from Johns Hopkins University verifies that iExcel meets ESSA Tier 1 standards. With those results combined with iExcel's teacher-friendly reputation, what more could you ask for? If you have a goal to increase achievement for all students, make sure to find out what iExcel can do for you. Visit iexcel.com/BE for a demo. That's iexcel.com/BE. Yeah, and so this is your third book, I believe. What made this one the book for now? Like this came out just a few months ago, so it's pretty fresh off the presses. What made this the one that you said, I got to write this book and I got to write it now?
Yeah, because the one I wrote right before this came out in the fall of 2021, and that one was called Leading Schools Through Trauma. And a lot of people might assume I wrote that because of the pandemic, and actually proposed it before the pandemic because I already knew trauma was rising in kids. And then during the pandemic, it just took off. So, of course, that's a very applicable book. But the radical principles concept really is organized more around, okay, we have problems in schools today. And that's okay. Like, schools can't be great, perfect all the time. We can be good and continue to become greater at what we do, just like great organizations. So great organizations don't sit on the laurels like Amazon and Google and Apple. And you think of any of the successful organizations who have continued to adapt to the realities. And that's what we need to do. We need to adapt to our reality. And a perfect example of that is we can't just say, well, we have schools that do a good job for most kids. That's not okay. You have to find ways to get that support, as I said. And this is about an equity gap. We have equity gaps in schools, and they're only increasing. They increased over the pandemic, and now they're just sitting at a too wide a margin. And they've always been there. but there's something that we need to tackle head on, and that's what I got.
Yeah, and so on the point of these equity needs within your school, who's involved, number one, in defining your equity goals and the gaps you're trying to close, the inequities you're trying to disrupt, and how do you go about that process of identifying those needs and then the goals you're working toward?
I'm so glad you mentioned who's involved, because that's such an important question that often either gets overlooked or is minimized. And here's why I would respond in this way. So there are two kinds of leaders generally, and of course they're along the spectrum. There are what we call multiplier leaders, and there are diminisher leaders. I'll give you a quick example of each. A diminisher leader is someone who has to always get all the attention dedicated to them. They're often power hungry. They're highly insecure. They often want to take all the credit. They don't want anybody to appear as intelligent as them. And unfortunately, there's too many darn leaders like that in our world today. And surprisingly, there's more of those kinds of leaders than I'd like to be on, I'd like to admit in education. Multiplier leaders are those that run organizations, like I mentioned earlier. They continue to accept the fact that they cannot stand alone and they need to organize so many great ideas. The worst thing that can happen in the school is that an excellent idea dies in a corner of that school in a classroom because a teacher either never thought to share it, or more importantly, the educational leaders in that school never thought to promote that. Even though most teachers are very humble and they don't really want to make a big deal out of something, the way I always get them around that and to be willing to share it is say, look, your idea is impacting kids, but it should be impacting 2,000 kids. And would you rather give up on those other like 1,900 and some odd kids? We need to be able to get that idea out to everybody. And then teachers get it. They go, oh, I want to help kids. That's why I'm here. So it's so important to create teams that feel comfortable with their leader. Humility is a huge part of what I write about, because if you're not a humble leader, then people aren't going to be able or willing to approach you and say, hey, I think this is a bad idea you're thinking about, or I think parts of this are a bad idea, or I have a better way to do this thing. And then for you to be receptive to that, it doesn't mean you have to take everything they say and run with it. It means that you have to listen to them and then take the parts that continue the successes and the opportunities available to you in your school community. So that's what I talk about. And it's so important to actively pursue that. I was telling you earlier, pre-broadcast, that I have a new school. And when I say that, I mean, it used to be a middle school. Now it's an upper elementary or grade 5 school. And what that did was it gave me 100% new students because of the way the cycles work in our schools. And it also gave me 60% new faculty to me, not new faculty to the school, but new faculty to me. So they might have been teaching in another school, but I didn't know more than half of these teachers. And they didn't know that I'm a leader who invites them to criticize me. They didn't know that. They're used to, unfortunately, in many cases, some examples in their experiences of not facing that. Fortunately, in our district, I do think we have more multiplier leaders, but they didn't know me. Who's the real multiplier here, right? So it did take about a marking period, 2.5 months, for them to say, when's the other shoe going to drop? And I found that the best way to effectively get to know them was to schedule meetings with them directly in times and ways that worked for them. And the best part about scheduling those meetings is I don't do those in the principal's office or some busy big conference room that looks intimidating. I go to their classroom and say, what's the best classroom? What's the most centrally located? Because I want them to know that their time and space is as important as mine or more, and that I need to engage them in that way. So I'm seeing a lot of that start to turn as previous faculties have, that they know they can come to me in a loving way and say, Mike, this is a bad idea, or I have a better way to do this thing that I think is great. And so that's the kind of freedom that a multiplier leader provides, and their staff needs to be able to know that they can come to them. This also works, of course, with students. Students have great ideas that we often either say, well, that'll never work, right? Because of the following bureaucratic limits, right? We have to stop saying that. And we have to figure out ways to bring that in. I do that, and I unpack a lot of the ideas in the book.
Yeah, excellent. So you talked about the multiplier leaders, and you also write about concept of diminishers, which could be applied to people, but it could also be practices. It could be your resources, right? What are we spending our time and money and effort and our passion on, right? And are they the things that are in fact multiplying and helping us work toward our objectives, or are they taking us further away from them? Or are we putting too much effort into this one thing that's just not really returning any results? And when it comes to figuring out, okay, who's this team of people that are going to be these multipliers that are really going to lead us to outcomes that are greater than the sum of our individual parts? One of the things that's interesting, one, it's really important to probably have that framework to go into it and say, look, as a multiplier leader, I need to go in and kind of see who's going to be around me, who's going to work towards this, who are going to be the other multipliers that, really create exponential value here. And the multiplier leader probably much better at doing that, because it feels to me that if you're not a multiplier leader, you probably feel like everybody's a diminisher, because anything that's not 100% aligned with what you want you're going to say that, well, this is detrimental, versus seeing it as, okay, we all really have different ideas, different areas of strength, different experience, and we need to kind of work together. But, talk a little bit about just like kind of through that mental framework of saying, okay, if we want to be successful towards these goals, we need to identify, importantly, who and what are the multipliers and the diminishers, and make the right choices about how we build our teams and how we build our practices.
Yeah, this is the power of exponential thought, right? So 2 good ideas can multiply out into maybe 5 new things or something like that. And it's this whole idea, and I'm not using perfect math, of course, here, but the idea is that when you bring multipliers together, you're actually really invigorating opportunities that go beyond just the ideas those 2 people had. Because suddenly you start creating new ideas, and it becomes this, like I said, compound effect or exponential thing. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier is timing all that, right? I definitely want to hit on timing, because timing is such a huge part of this. Because one of the first reactions an educational leader or educator who's listening to a podcast might think is, yeah, but I don't have the time to do all that. Like, I just need to react and put out fires, and that's what my day's like. And unfortunately, that happens all too often, and it seems to happen more than maybe previously, because we're in a fast-paced, social media-driven world. One of the things that I have to stress on this is you can manage your time better and then become more radical in your approaches, like being a multiplier leader. So, for instance, if you understand the way that timing works, and you understand how your personal schedule works. Dan Pink is an author who talks about this in a book called When, and he did tons of research before he wrote this. And he does a good job. I like to follow his style, weaving science and story together. So I'll tell you some stories, but then I'll back it up with science that just makes sense. So when he looked at this, he realized that people run through these cyclical patterns during the course of every day, and they're surprisingly predictable. And understanding that and knowing how you function allows you to deal with that. So I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. One of the worst things that we can do is first thing in the morning, do what just about all of us do, go for our phone and start reading emails and things like that, especially in education, because we often get like emails from upset parents, or this last minute thing has to be done, or you feel so rough. And it's much more powerful if we can manage this to use that first time in the morning as a treasure, as a creativity moment. So I often personally go exercise during this time, because now I'm also moving the body, which means I'm moving the mind. Because once I start moving and blood is moving through, it's rushing to my brain as well and affecting all that. And what's so exciting about that is I actually do some of my most writing when I'm exercising, and I've got my phone with me and I pull out my notepad and I start jotting down an idea, because the creativity juices start flowing. And I preserve that time away from looking at things like email or any of those other things that are going to completely disrupt me and my train of thought. Because what happens is you go from a potentially very creative time mode when you wake up first thing in the morning to this primal mentality that goes right to our fight, flight, or run. Is a fight, flight. There's always I forget the third one, but you get the idea.
Fight, flight, or freeze.
Freeze, thank you. I just froze. Fight, flight, or freeze. We become we go right to the more primal states of our brain. And now we're not being radical because we can't be creative. So we have to preserve those times. Now, some people on this that are listening might say, yeah, but I'm a night owl. That's great. He talks about that too, Dan Pink. He unpacks that and says, okay, know the times in your day. And I actually share a quick survey that shows when you know how to manage your time. And it just basically says, it encapsulates it for you and says, use this time wisely. So that's why I'm focusing so much on time, because it's so typical for educational leaders and educators to get caught up, swept up in this time wave that feels like it's too disruptive. And I'll give you another quick example. I call them email wars. And it could be an email or it could be social media, it doesn't matter. And email wars are when you get that really angry, somewhat irrational, usually factually inaccurate email from either a parent or somebody that's upset about something that happened, either with their kid or whatever, right? And you know it's inaccurate. So the worst thing we can do is get defensive and write an email back. Because what happens next? The emails start escalating and they start pulling things out of context. And unfortunately, with digital communication, we're thinking about things in a two-dimensional framework. We're three-dimensional human beings. We have emotions, intonation, and our delivery is different. So people start to dehumanize when they're reading this stuff and they start misinterpreting everything. I saw a study once that showed 7% is effective as talking through things. That's, even if that's highly inaccurate, it's definitely got the right ideas. And by the way, they did back it up with science. So you can Google that. Email is 7% is effective as talking. And it's so important for us to remember that, because what we want to do is something that Jade Bear from Hug Your Haters calls reply only twice. And I love this concept. He bases it on customer service. Aren't we a customer service business working with families in our community? So when you get that angry email, what you want to do is say, I'm really sorry that you are upset about this, and I'd like to talk to you about this. When is a good time to talk? If the follow-up email to that becomes something even angrier or more escalated, which, by the way, it almost never does. But when it does, now we're really unprepared, because what do? And they start making claims and no, I'm really mad and this whole thing. You have to remember that this thing can be exposed on social media. They can take a screenshot. This is what people do and say, look what this principal did. Look how rude he was. And instead what you need to do is say, again, I want to take the time with you to talk about this more personally so I can help you. Nobody needs to worry about how that will look online, because that looks like you took higher moral ground and you're able to do that and save face. And what's so great about that is that if that person continues to escalate, you can cease the conversation. That's the concept of reply only twice, because you have set the stage and you put your beliefs out in front of them. But this is how we talk to each other. We talk in person. We talk respectfully to each other, because this is your school and you want them to emulate that if they choose. By the way, most people will take the time to say, wow, they're going to talk to me personally. Instead, that's wonderful. I'm really happy about that. And I want to take advantage of that. And they're already more satisfied as they get the door open. You say, hey, let's talk. This is important. We don't want to rush this through an email or misunderstanding. And so I always tell people, don't get into these crazy email threads that are back and forth and back and forth. I always say to a parent, when can I call you? Now, some people may say, well, the call is going to take more time. That's completely categorically false, because think about those email words back and forth. And the worst is every time you send an email, you're anticipating the next angry one, and your brain's back in that primal space. So you got to get people offline. And that's what Jay Bear talks about with social media, not just email, but social media communication too.
Right.
You may wind up with somebody trying to communicate with you on Facebook or anywhere. How this procedure or this strategy works anywhere you're on digital.
Right. And something relevant to think about is that Jay Bear, with the reply only twice, model advisement there, it's premised on the fact that those people you're replying to are your important customers, your important stakeholders, right? So it's not something where it's saying like, just tune out the noise, don't worry. It's saying, all right, it's important for you to engage with these people, but to do it productively and to have a plan to do that, right? Because otherwise, in the moment, you either get distracted or you're stressed, and you kind of lose control of the situation, versus saying, I have a specific approach, I'm going to replicate it, and we're going to engage productively, because ultimately it's important that we come to an understanding and a resolution, and we can't let it get away from us. And in digital means, no matter what it is, whether people are acting in good faith or bad faith or whatever, it's way too easy for things to be misconstrued, taken out of context, to have every now and then it gives your counterpart, right, the opportunity to reflect on, okay, maybe I made some assumptions when I sent this initial email, right? Because the person replied to me and they said they'd be happy to talk to me. And I was expecting them to be defensive, and they're not. So maybe I was assuming the way they were going to respond, and that affected my tone when I sent them the message in the first place. So it's kind of saying, all right, it's emotions are high when we're talking about kids and their education and their future and parents. There's a lot of dynamics going on here. And it's just important to say we need to get to where we need to get to and not dig deeper into a hole. So something good to think about there. What that I did want to touch on is that kind of the subtitle for the book is A Blueprint for Long-Term Equity and Stability at School. And that jumped out at me because it made me want to ask you, how do those ideas go together, right? Because to me, and I'm sure it makes sense to you, but that equity piece is about being destabilizing, right? The status quo, destabilizing inequities that have been baked in and saying, hey, we can't just keep going on the way we have been, right? Now, we don't want it to feel like everybody's standing on these little blocks of ice, trying not to fall into the frozen ocean kind of thing. But it's about saying, look, it's not good enough to just kind of go along to get along. It's smooth sailing because there's all these things underneath the surface or above the surface, but depending on your school, that if we're not thinking about what are our blind spots, what are our maybe unintentional or unintended biases in the areas that we're not paying enough attention to, things might just kind of seem fine. And that's where we need to be really taking strides to destabilize that dynamic, right? So I kind of wanted to just get your thoughts on that and just sort of how you are going for those parallel goals, right? Of like saying, okay, we need to really make these efforts to improve equity, but we also want to create an environment that feels solid. It has that stability that we want in a school, reliable, trustworthy to our stakeholders and so on.
Yeah, I love the way you said subconscious or unconscious bias in people. That's a big part of what has to be overturned. We're all good people who care about kids, but we come with those biases. That's not something to be upset about, but it's something to be aware about. So because if we're aware of it, we can start to override those things that are preventing us from giving the support to the kids that need it. So I think the best way to characterize this is a story from the book. I'll just tell you this real quick. So a few years ago, my superintendent came to me and he said, I need to move the entire preschool program, which is about 200 kids, into your school. And I said, well, I don't have room for that. And he said, we have to move it into the school. So I said, okay, boss. And I had to figure out how to move these 200 kids into my school, which were completely unrelated to the rest of my school. So I figured this out somehow. And when we moved them into the school, I decided to make lemonade out of lemons. And what I did was, because it was a disruption, it was overcrowding our school, it was creating some other obstacles. But I thought to myself, I've got a resource here that I should probably take advantage of. So there was a kid named Chris, a pseudonym, by the way, and he was the kind of kid who he was about 6 feet tall in 7th grade. He ran too fast down the hall and he talked too loud. And sometimes I'd walk down the hall and see a teacher waving a finger at him in the corner as he stood over them. Mm-hmm. Chris was not progressing with that. And that's not that teacher's fault. That teacher was doing the best they thought they could. So what I did was, and I stole this idea from the assistant principal. We talked about multiplier effect. This is not my idea, but it grew from this, right? She suggested, why don't we ask him to go in and read to the little kids if he can improve his behavior? So I thought, why not? What else are we going to do? We have teachers running up to us and saying, this kid needs to be suspended and the whole 9 yards, right? And by the way, suspension has no positive effect on any child who's suspended. And worse, has a negative effect on the kids around him or her. So people don't necessarily know that or realize that. But when we're suspending a kid, we're creating a more toxic climate for everybody. So I went up to this kid and I thought, he's going to think I'm crazy, but I've asked crazier questions. And I said, if you have a good week in school, would you be willing to read to the preschoolers? And I thought he was going to say, you're crazy, Gaskell. What are you talking about? And instead, he smiled ear to ear and said, I would love to do that. I said, okay. He had a good week because he was motivated, a good enough week. And we brought him in to read to these 3-year-olds. Now, here's the great thing about 3-year-olds. It's like pet therapy, right? Because you feel great with their excitement, their passion, and they don't see a 6-foot-tall African-American disadvantaged child. They don't see that runs too fast down the hall and talks too loud. What they see is an older child reading a book to them that they love, and
Right.
they were asking him when he was coming back to read. And born was middles to littles in my school. We created a program, I wrote a grant, I got t-shirts, and suddenly the other kids were running up to me and saying, when can I read? And I said, you have to have a good week. And these were the cool kids. So it became cool to do this. And all because of Chris, who was a well-liked kid. The second part to this that was even more powerful was that you had teachers who were going up to him when he was running too fast now, and without even realizing it, saying to him, when are you reading next? And he'd say, oh, I'm supposed to read on Tuesday. And suddenly he stopped running too fast. They never addressed the issue with him. They didn't back him into a corner. Instead, they redirected him. And they came to me later and said, I never thought this program would work. I thought you were crazy. This is amazing. He's not running in the halls, or at least when I talk to him, he's listening now instead of giving me a dirty line. And so we started doing this with other kids. This became a culture shift. And you talked about equity and stability at the same time. Isn't this happening in a scenario like this?
Right.
So this is not one silver bullet, and it doesn't work for every kid all the time. You'll never hear me say, there's a solution, and this is how you should do it for every kid. What you'll hear me say is, here's 7 or 19 ideas, try 12 or 3 of them, and maybe a handful of those ideas will work for these kids, and another handful of ideas will work for this kid. Who cares? The point is, stack your ideas, consolidate them, and throw them out at kids. Be flexible, be adaptive. You can't just say, we're going to keep doing these same things in schools. You got to say, let's try this, that, and the other thing. And by the way, this program got so much attention that the commissioner of education joined my superintendent and went and watched one of these in progress and celebrated with, the commissioner of education is like the right-hand man or woman of the governor in the state of New Jersey. So this is a really exciting thing when you think about it, because now it's getting all this promotion, but it's like any great idea. I would never sit there and say to you, this should be applied for every kid who's disadvantaged or every kid who's struggling at anything, right? Instead, what I would say to you is this is one of 9 ideas I tried. And maybe 4 or 5 of those 9 ideas will work. That's my point.
And now a quick break for a word from our sponsor, MyFlex Learning. Let's talk about flex time in schools. The potential benefits to our students make it totally worth exploring. There's more time for personalized learning, increased choice and agency for students, and the increased engagement that comes along with it, dedicated time for intervention, and overall, as school leaders, it provides you and your faculty more tools to increase academic achievement. But the implementation and management of flex time can be a challenge. Tricky logistics and a lack of clear accountability systems can prevent teachers from buying in. It can hold you back from ensuring students make good use of their time. That's why I'm pleased to share that MyFlex Learning provides a solution to these challenges and more. MyFlex Learning helps you create and manage flexible time for any purpose. And with the seamless SIS integration, a student locator, flexible daily rostering, and intuitive mobile app, it eliminates the common challenges of implementation and management. If you want to see for yourself, visit myflexlearning.com/BE to learn more and receive $500 off the first year of use. That's myflexlearning.com/BE. You'll learn all about MyFlex Learning, what it can do for your school, and you'll receive a $500 off offer for your first year. Check it out. And so part of that, right, was starting it and saying, yeah, right, like you said, well, like, let's come up with as many ideas as we can. Let's try some of them. Some will work, some won't. But we have to be motivated to just give it a shot and be okay with that. Be okay with that. Not every one of them is going to turn out to work the way we hope. So there's starting and then there's sustaining, right? So, I think there's a lot in the book about mindsets and kind of just the mentalities that you're taking and And part of that is to start and sustain the work. So kind of what are some of those mindsets, those views? We can put it pretty much, we could look at our principals and assistant principals, right, who are most in position to start these things. And then to say, okay, I need to be in the mindset to be this radical principal to pursue these goals.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things that I'll point out. One is Adam Grant wrote a book about the concepts of an open mindset, and he does a lot of he's a social scientist or a psychologist, and he has written a lot about being, open. We talked about this before with the multiplier meeting, but more specifically, an open mindset means that, again, we go back to subconscious biases, not assuming that you are all knowing or you have all the answers, right? And the important part to this is we know that when an idea is challenged, we shouldn't just say that's wrong and I'm right. One of the challenges we face today, I think everybody can acknowledge this, is that we live in a very polarized political world, and polarization doesn't help anybody. What we need to do instead is not necessarily agree with, but accept what another person's position is. And there's a difference there. And when we learn to do that, it's a really important concept. I'll tell you a real quick true story that I found online, and it's about this concept of lateral thinking. So there was this kid, and he's driving with his dad, and suddenly they get backed up in this huge traffic jam. So they walk up to the front of this because it's taking forever. They want to see what's happening. And there is a Mack truck, a big truck, wedged under a bridge. It obviously was a driver who didn't pay attention to the dimensions of the bridge. And you have these police up there, and you have like experts that trying to make suggestions. And they're saying, well, if we push it through, or maybe we back it up, how much damage will it create for the infrastructure of the bridge and the truck? And what are some of the things? Can we kind of push the bridge up a little bit with a vice or something? And in the end, there's this kid who's next to his dad, and he keeps saying, hey, dad. And the dad says, hang on a second. And he's trying to listen to what's going on. And finally, the kid says, Dad, I have an idea. So the guy says, what? And the kid says, why don't they just let the air out of the tires? And it was like, you had all these experts, right? So here's the point. When we become masters at something, like you and I are masters generally at education and educational leadership, when we become masters at something, we start to exclude the possibilities that aren't in that mastery inventory. And that's all part of a natural thing that our brain does. If we open our mind and do this in a conscious way, we can really start to make that shift happen. So that's why I wanted to share the story about lateral thinking and the 9-year-old kid at the bridge. I mean, he was thinking laterally or alternatively, right? And so a lot of times kids, we're educators, we know this, come up with great ideas that I never would have thought of. And so it's not just kids, of course, it's anybody. But this story was about a kid, which I had to share because we're in education.
Yeah, no, that's it's an excellent example of the concept that once we know how something is supposed to work, we sometimes are blind to the cases where it's not going to work that way, and where somebody who's starting from scratch or trying to problem solve is going to come up with a different solution that works in those cases where things just aren't going to go the typical way. So one of the things that you write about there, that was a quick fix that kid came up with. You write about how there's these day-to-day quick fixes that happen. They need to happen, right? Something comes up, we have to solve it. But that there can also be times where getting into the habit of those quick fixes can prevent the long-term change that we want to work toward. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, I think that applies as well to kind of the mindsets, right? And having those plans towards your goals and saying, all right, we do need to spend time and attention on some things other than just this big picture long-term goal. However, not let it derail us. How do those kind of work together?
Yeah, so I think when you have quick fixes, they can become like the instant silver bullet, and we mistake. I talked about the teacher with the great idea in the corner of the school that will die there if it never gets out. We can't let those things go. A good example of this is, I'll do something I call an ed camp, which ed camps are pretty well known by now. These are these great informal like PD sessions where people just bring their own ideas and share out, and you kind of have like these walk-up sessions, and you can just pick the session you want to go to and get these ideas shared out. Well, my faculty has great ideas. So I encourage them to have an ed camp every year where they bring their ideas. And what's so amazing about these ed camps, remember, these are not my ideas, these are their ideas, right? Is number one, they feel empowered, they feel excited. And teachers respect hearing from other teachers too. And many times more so than me, right? Because I'm not in the classroom every day. So I love engaging this. But additionally, what's so great about that is when you have an ed camp like this, what I find happens most often is cross-departmental people who never run into each other. Let's say a science teacher and a phys ed teacher or something like that. They may never run into each other in meetings or discussion groups, professional development. We're all in a hurry, just trying to get to the next meeting. Bringing them together in this kind of format and then sharing those ideas, most frequently what happens is the feedback is, I never knew about this idea because it was from this other department or this person in another subject area. And now I can use that in a way. And then they start sharing ideas out in their way that becomes an adaptive version of that. So we talked about this whole exponential thing. And so we're sharing these ideas that allow us to start plan things that are not just quick fixes, but are building into this long-term solution. I think that's the important message there, right?
Yeah, excellent. And we don't want to, I think, confuse those quick fixes with small wins, right? There can be times where those things feel almost the same, or we might overlook or say, okay, we don't want to get in the habit of just doing a bunch of little things, but at the same time, we want to recognize and appreciate when we do solve something, when we have those little wins. And so how about the power of small wins, and how does that fit into this mix?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the power of small wins is this, like so many great ideas, has been a successful concept outside of education. And we often don't hear about these things or way down the road when, not that it's too late, but it just took too long. So I try to bring ideas like this. There was a Harvard study where they looked at the successes of companies. And again, I talked earlier about these successful organizations and why are they so successful? And over again, what they kept coming up with was these companies were celebrating their performers, which in our case were kids, with small wins. They were recognizing these micro victories that they were achieving, not just the big long-term thing, but they were stopping and paying attention. This kind of, and this is, what is this? This is feedback in education, right? If we're able to show kids, we can do this verbally, we can do this in multiple ways, that they were here at their reading level and they've moved up to this many spaces, 3 spaces in 3 months. Even if they should have moved up 5 spaces, who cares? Show them the growth that they've made. This is a very empowering and psychologically powerful way to get kids to move forward. And by the way, it's also great for adults because we have adults that need some positive feedback in our schools too, don't we? Because they're going in classrooms every day and trying to build up kids. So it's so important for us to take a moment and say, wait a minute, power of small wins, big deal. So I did a lot of research on this, and I was so surprised to find that I couldn't find the concept of small wins anywhere. So what did I do? I started writing about it.
Yeah.
And I've written articles about it, and of course it's in Radical Principle. So how the small win concept is so significant, and it's often missed because, as you said, we're trying to do these short, quick fixes instead of stopping for a moment and saying, wait a minute, did you see what you just did today? I'll just tie this real quickly into something else, and that's the praise to criticism ratio. So think about praise. It has to be authentic. It should not. This guy named Bissell wrote about the 5 elements of praise, and one of them was authenticity. So I'll give you an example. Kid comes in, or you had a good class, you say, great job, everybody. That doesn't tell anybody anything other than that you were happy with them, right? It doesn't tell them something specific that they can grab a hold of and feel that small win. So when we're giving praise, we should say, I really like the way you were able to complete 3 out of those 4 problems, right? And the other thing is there was this guy, John Gottman, who was a psychologist that studied successful married couples. That's an important topic, right? When 50% of our couples are failing. And what he wanted to know is what's working in these marriages that's not working in unsuccessful marriage. And what he found was the ratio of praise to criticism in these marriages was 3 praises to 1 criticism or higher. Okay. So by the way, there was a point of diminished return. You couldn't keep praising somebody. People would realize that's BS. If you go like 15-1, I think the cutoff was 13 to 1, but 3 to 5 to 1. And so PBIS, which is a national program that talks about positive behavior in schools, has great videos on this that show teachers doing this. So what did we do? We did decide in many schools that use PBIS or PBSIS in New Jersey, same concept, to bring this into our classrooms. And they were actually showing even more success with kids than they were with successful marriages. It was amazing. So as I said, thinking about feedbacks and building kids up, this is more important than ever because kids are coming out of a post-pandemic where they're often traumatized. They face a lot of social media negative exposure, and just seems like things are tougher, right? It's so important for them to highlight to them the reality, which is there are a lot of small successes, and you need to be rewarded for it, which in turn makes them want to go further. Think about that, like when you're trying to achieve a task or a goal. Oftentimes you'll say, well, I'll just spend 20 minutes on this. But when you feel the success in that, you're going to push that to 30 and you're going to keep going. So there's these ideas that kids want to keep going, not necessarily in minutes, but just longitudinally, as you talked about, over time to pursue a goal, because Rome wasn't built in a day. And we often think about the big victory at the end. That's great, but that's an unrealistic way to think about success.
Right. And it seems that like a resistance to celebrating small wins would come from a misunderstanding of motivation, right? And thinking, well, if we just praise people for every little thing, then they're going to stop working hard, versus saying, no, you're allowing them to see that they're making progress, to see that somebody's aware of them. It can be done as appropriate. In your reference to the married couples, if this one spouse does the dishes or something, it can be thank you. It doesn't have to be comparing it to the lunar landing, but it can just be saying, oh, thanks for doing that. That was really helpful, right? And it's just saying, all right, well, now I'll do it again tomorrow because I know that it wasn't in vain, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other piece of that being, right, so let's not see those successes as temporary, see them as part of a trajectory, see them as incremental building blocks, and not like, okay, if you did this one thing, okay, it worked today, and okay, but it's one step to the next thing, and it's particularly with students to be much more focused on what learning trajectory are they on versus what grade, what's their GPA or anything like that, but are they growing? Are they learning? Do they know more today than they knew yesterday? Do they have a new skill? Do they feel better about what they're doing? And it really is that powerful thing, and it's a motivator. So we're kind of winding down here, but one thing that I definitely wanted to bring up before we close with reference to the book is making time for restoration. This is a lot of work. It's hard work. It's daily work. It's consistent. So how do leaders kind of make that time to make sure they are restored, re-energized, and not burning out all of their energy when they kind of need to replenish?
Yeah, it's such an important thing, right? Because it's literally our bodies and our minds are just like the phone that's dying. We need a recharge. We need to be regenerated. Or we're just gonna pan out, right? And one of the things that I talk about in the book is there's some important practices we should be applying to ensure that we're taking care of ourselves, because we can't be that radical principle if we're coming in exhausted and reacting all the time. So we do need to take that time for ourselves. And there's some simple practices. I talk about breath work, which is pretty well known in the field by now, but I specify one called the 4-7-8 method. And the reason that I like the 4-7-8 method is because you're breathing in for 4 seconds, you're holding for 7, and then you're letting out for 8 seconds. So there's a differential there. What that differential does is it literally massages your diaphragm. It has a very therapeutic effect on your internal body space, which of course ties right to you. And this can be a very quick thing that can happen right at your desk, 5 minutes, the impact is recognized. So that's what, and the great thing about breath work, of course, is that you bring it with you everywhere. So you don't need to go track this down or really pretty much do this anywhere, because as long as you're not in the middle of obviously having a discussion or something. But this is really helpful when you're having those really taxing moments. Another example is something I call binaural beats. So binaural beats are not well known. I just presented about this at the Radical Principles presentation here at FETC. And it was really interesting because I asked my audience, does any of you know what this is? Have you heard of this? And not a single hand went up. And I continued to see that until somebody hears me or reads my book. And then they realize, oh, this is really cool. So let me just tell you really quickly how this works and then why it can be so helpful. So when you're listening with headphones, with binaural beats, you have one tone at a certain frequency in one ear and a different tone in a different frequency in the other ear. You can find binaural beats, by the way, anywhere. YouTube, you can Google it, they're everywhere. And so it's all free. And what's happening is because they're at different frequencies, your brain starts to interpret after about 3 to 5 minutes, by the way, it doesn't happen right away, a virtual third sound. That third sound sounds sci-fi, I know, but that's what's so cool about it because it really works and we know from science. That third sound starts to target parts of your brain that affect everything from, and you can select different kinds of binaural beats, and you can Google this, relaxation, so that it gets you in a more calm state. You can do a high focus one and concentration so that it gets you focused on a task. You can get a motivational one. You can get a pre-workout binaural beat. Yeah. And so there's all these different options that you can navigate through. And in the example you're using, restoration, that's a perfect example of a binaural beat that gets you in a very relaxed and sort of mindful state. As I said, it only takes about 3 to 5 minutes before it starts to work, and then you need to give it at least 5 more minutes. So realistically, 10 minutes. But that's another really cool one. And the nice thing about binaural beats is you almost have the menu to select from. What do I want to focus on? I want to be focused. I want to be energized. I want to be motivated. I want to be relaxed. And as I said, you can go right on YouTube or Google and find the different options. My recommendation when you search is to make sure that it appears to be a science-based one, because I don't want you to just go to like a random one that someone claims is a binaural beat, and make sure you have your headphones in.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Mike and listeners, we mentioned that Mike has his podcast, Big Ideas in Small Windows. Season 2 of that will be launching right around the time this episode publishes. So if you head over there and subscribe, you'll hear some new episodes. Mike, can you give us a preview of anything that's upcoming on the podcast and also anywhere else that listeners should connect with you?
Yeah, so I'll be talking about some other topics in my writings. I write monthly for Smartbrief, and that always ends up in ASCD Smartbrief if you're familiar with that. I have a monthly column, and I like to take those ideas and turn them into a discussion format, because some people just want to listen on their ride in to work or whatever. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be unpacking those ideas in articles right on my podcast.
Excellent. Well, Mike Gaskell, thanks so much for being on The Authority. Listeners, find the link below to Radical Principles, the book. You can purchase it, hear a lot more about all of these ideas. We'll also link to Mike's podcast. We'll check out some other resources that are there for you. So check all of that out. And please do subscribe to The Authority for more in-depth author interviews, or visit thepodcast.network to learn about all of our network shows. Mike, thanks again.
Thanks, Ross. I appreciate it.
This has been the Authority Podcast, hosted by Ross Romano, edited by Gage Sanderson.
Do you want to simplify your school's technology, save teachers time, and improve students' performance on state assessments? You can do it all, but don't waste another minute. Head straight to ixl.com/BE to learn how IXL's research-proven teaching and learning platform can help you achieve all of these goals. That's ixl.com/BE.